The email bounced back for the third time, flagged as undeliverable. Ava Kelly stared at the screen, blinking hard as her inbox filled with automated replies, couriers, contractors, subscription services, all failing to recognize an address she had used for 15 years. Her jaw tightened as she clicked into the failed delivery report and scanned the reason. Invalid destination Larchwood Drive does not exist. She shoved her chair back and stormed to the front door, heart pounding. The mail had been late all week, but now it wasn't just late. It was lost. She stepped barefoot onto the porch, still in her work-from-home leggings and an oversized hoodie, and looked down the street she knew by heart. Except something felt wrong. The street sign at the corner no longer said Larchwood Drive. It had been replaced. New metal, new font, new name. Oak Harmony Lane. Her breath caught. For a second it didn't register as real. Then the nausea rolled in. Ava crossed the yard barefoot, barely noticing the morning dew soaking into her socks as she walked toward the sign like it had personally insulted her. It wasn't just a cosmetic change. It wasn't a minor rebranding. It was a complete erasure of the name she'd written on birthday invitations, engraved on her dad's headstone, stitched into monogrammed towels after she bought the home from her parents. She had grown up on Larchwood Drive. Her father had planted the trees. Her mother had named the street unofficially when the city left it blank on the zoning map back in the 90s. And now the HOA had replaced it without a single warning. She spun on her heel and looked up the block. Every sign had been replaced. Clean bronze plaques on green steel posts, all branded with the same soft cursive and embossed leaf icon. Some of her neighbors had new house numbers too, fresh paint, even updated plaques on a few mailboxes. She hadn't received so much as a flyer. No email, no form to sign, no chance to vote. The HOA office wasn't far, and Ava didn't bother to change out of her hoodie before getting into her car and pulling into the clubhouse lot. Inside, the new board president, Whitney Ford, sat behind the reception desk sipping out of a monogrammed tumbler that matched the new signage. Ava walked in like a storm was following her. "You changed the name of our street." Whitney looked up slowly. "We updated several names across the community. It's part of the neighborhood modernization rollout. You didn't notify us. Not even a note. Larchwood Drive isn't a decoration. It's on legal documents. Driver's licenses. Shipping addresses. Technically, Larchwood was never an official designation." Whitney interrupted. "It was just a placeholder left over from an older map file. It's not a placeholder to the people who live there." Whitney set her tumbler down carefully, as if she were trying to appear patient. "This rebranding was approved by the board and logged in our last quarterly report. It's about aligning the neighborhood's visual identity with its community values." Ava took a breath to stop herself from yelling. "My home has value because of the life built on that name. You don't get to erase that because it clashes with your font choice." Whitney gave a tight, polite smile. "The new names reflect peace, nature, and renewal. Oak Harmonies tested very well in our homeowner surveys. Funny, no one on my street remembers getting a survey." Ava left before she could say something she'd regret. Not because she was afraid of consequences, because she already knew what had to happen next. She couldn't go back and undo what they'd done, but she was done playing defense. If they wanted to control the name, they'd have to fight for it, because she'd just decided she was going to buy the rights to it first. Ava didn't tell anyone what she was planning. Not her neighbors, not her friends, not even her sister who usually heard everything first. Instead, she spent the next 3 evenings alone at her kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of county records, zoning ordinances, and local business registration forms, half printed, half scribbled on with highlighters and sticky notes. She wasn't looking for drama, she was looking for leverage. Because if the HOA could change a name, then surely someone could change it back. And if they couldn't, she would make sure she owned the name they stole. The first thing she learned was this: Larchwood Drive had never been officially adopted by the city. It existed on neighborhood plat maps, used in local listings, mentioned in informal ways. real estate ads, school directories, even birthday invitations. But the road itself had been classified as private access, community designated, meaning the name had been chosen and maintained by the developer and then turned over to the HOA. It also meant that Larchwood Drive had never been formally registered in the municipal naming registry. That loophole was what the HOA had exploited, but what they hadn't realized, what they hadn't bothered to check, was that unregistered street names, especially those not recognized by emergency services or USPS, were still eligible for commercial claim if they weren't copyrighted. Ava took the printed zoning ordinance and read it again, word for word. There it was in black and white: street names not recorded with the county engineer's office may be considered intellectual or brand property if used in signage, digital media, or commercial advertising. Which meant Larchwood wasn't just sentimental, it was unclaimed intellectual property, and now she knew exactly what to do. She drove into town the next morning and parked across from the county clerk's office. The building was small, beige, and smelled like air freshener and bureaucracy, but the clerk behind the desk was friendly, and more importantly helpful. Ava filed an LLC, Larchwood Collective LLC, listed as a design consultancy that specialized in historic neighborhood branding. She paid the expedited fee. Within 24 hours, she owned the business name. But she didn't stop there. Next, she applied for commercial sign rights. Not just for marketing, for placement. She registered Larchwood Drive as a community-adjacent historic brand designation and filed for temporary installation rights through the city's pilot program for micro-business districts. It was the same program the local farmers market had used to erect banners on a residential street last year. The program allowed decorative sign placement on privately maintained roads with a registered LLC and a valid insurance policy. Ava met both requirements within 48 hours. Then she bought the domain, larchwooddrive.org. She created a landing page, simple, clean, a photo of her father planting trees in the early 90s, a tagline that read, "History isn't something you rebrand," and beneath it a single sentence, "The real story of Larchwood Drive," before the HOA forgot to ask permission. By the end of the week, she had printed vinyl signs, brown lettering on classic green, identical in size and style to the new oak harmony ones the HOA had installed. She had them mounted professionally by a local sign vendor who didn't ask questions and didn't charge full price once he heard the story. She didn't put them up right away. First, she filed a courtesy notice with the city, marking the proposed installation date. Then she emailed the HOA. Her message was short. No rant, no threats, just a calm announcement. To ensure community continuity and honor the original history of this neighborhood, I will be exercising my right to install decorative markers along the length of the previously known Larchwood Drive. These signs are covered under my commercial license through Larchwood Collective LLC, and I have filed the appropriate documentation with the county. No response is necessary. She signed it, attached the permit, and hit send. Then she waited, not for approval, just for impact. The response came the next afternoon, not from Whitney, but from the HOA's legal liaison. A vaguely condescending message filled with words like unauthorized, confusing, and potential disruption. Ava read it once, then forwarded it to the county program manager she'd spoken to earlier. His reply arrived 10 minutes later. "You're good to go. They don't own the name." That Friday morning, just before sunrise, the new signs went up, mounted below the Oak Harmony plaques, the familiar green rectangles with white block letters now read, "Historic Larchwood Drive, estimated 1991. People noticed, neighbors took pictures. Some laughed. Others cried. A few knocked on Ava's door just to say thank you. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't post about it online. She just stood at the edge of her driveway, looking up at the sign her father would have recognized, and waited for the HOA to realize they had just been outplayed. Ava knew they were coming the moment she saw Whitney's SUV parked crookedly in front of the newly installed Larchwood marker. The vehicle's hazard lights blinked like an unspoken warning, and the HOA board president stood next to it with her arms crossed, flanked by two other board members, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Ava stepped off her porch slowly, locking the front door behind her. Even though she had no intention of leaving, she wasn't carrying files or papers. She didn't need to. The signs were still standing, the permits were still active, and her rights were fully documented. Whitney didn't wait for Ava to reach the sidewalk. "We've received several complaints," she began, her tone already brittle, "about these unauthorized signs creating confusion in the community." Ava raised an eyebrow and kept walking. "They're not unauthorized," she said calmly. "And they're not confusing. They're historic markers, perfectly legal, properly registered, and fully documented with the city." Whitney gestured toward the Larchwood sign, like it was a piece of graffiti rather than a tribute. "Your display contradicts the official street name. It's misleading. People are asking if the board reversed our vote. You didn't vote. You rebranded without consent, without notice, and without a single resident's input. And now you're upset because someone decided not to let you rewrite history unchecked." The man standing beside Whitney, a board member Ava didn't recognize, cleared his throat nervously. "Even if your markers are technically legal, this feels like you're undermining the neighborhood's identity." Ava turned fully to face him. "No, what undermines a neighborhood's identity is erasing 30 years of lived history with a font change and a marketing brochure. These signs don't distort anything. They restore what you tried to whitewash with a pretty leaf logo." He opened his mouth to respond, but said nothing, because there was nothing left to argue. Across the street, two neighbors had stopped raking their leaves and were now quietly listening. One of them, an older man in a Briar Glen baseball cap, crossed his arms and nodded faintly as Ava spoke. Whitney clearly noticed the growing attention but pushed forward anyway. "This could open the HOA to liability," she said sharply. "If emergency services misidentify the road, they won't." Ava interrupted. "I already confirmed with dispatch. The official address on record remains Oak Harmony Lane. My signs are registered as commercial memorial displays. They're not GPS designated. You would know that if you had done a tenth of the research I did." Whitney blinked hard, as if trying to swallow down the fact that someone outside the board had done her homework for her. "This isn't a personal attack, Ava. It is when it erases my father's name from a street he helped plant trees on." That sentence didn't just land. It echoed. Even Whitney seemed to feel it. Her jaw tightened, but her shoulders sagged slightly, like the weight of what she had pretended was a harmless rebrand was now showing its true depth. She tried one last attempt at control. "We're going to issue a cease and desist letter. These signs violate the neighborhood's visual cohesion standard." Ava didn't laugh. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply reached into her back pocket and handed Whitney a single sheet of paper. "That's the city's official approval, signed and time-stamped. Feel free to forward it to your lawyer, your signage committee, or whoever else you plan to waste time with." Whitney took the paper but didn't look at it. She was already losing control of the conversation, and more importantly, the crowd. Half a dozen more neighbors had stepped outside by now. No one was shouting, but the presence was undeniable. People were watching, listening, standing behind Ava without saying a word. "You're setting a dangerous precedent," Whitney muttered. "So did you," Ava replied. "You just didn't expect anyone to challenge it." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the man in the Briar Glen cap cleared his throat. "We didn't ask for Oak Harmony. We were never given a say. That street name means something to a lot of us, and I think what Ava's done here is exactly what leadership should have done before making that decision. Ask if it mattered." Another woman down the block called out softly. "She's the only one who honored our voice." Whitney turned, clearly overwhelmed. She didn't argue again. She didn't explain. She just walked back to her SUV, with the cease and desist letter crumpled slightly in her hand, her heels tapping hard against the sidewalk. The two board members followed, their silence louder than anything Whitney had said all morning. Ava remained standing beneath the sign for several minutes after they drove away. She didn't move. She didn't need to, because the confrontation was over, and for once, the board hadn't walked away, feeling like they still controlled the story. The street may have changed on paper, but the people were remembering what it had always been, and now, it belonged to them again. Whitney didn't go down without a final power play. She couldn't win in public, and she couldn't win through legal channels. But what she still had, what she always relied on, was control over perception. And so, in the days following the confrontation at Ava's corner, she tried to reframe the entire situation from the inside. The HOA newsletter, normally filled with landscaping tips and reminders about trash bins, arrived 2 days early. It wasn't subtle. Right on the front page, in bold serif font, it read, "Recent unauthorized signage creates confusion in Briar Glen, board working to restore unity." The article went on to describe Ava's signs as unsanctioned, divisive, and counterproductive to the community's refreshed identity. There was no mention of the legal permits, the LLC registration, or the city's approval. Just a vague assertion that individuals acting outside the HOA's vision were compromising cohesion. Whitney hadn't used Ava's name. She didn't need to. Everyone knew who the message was about. Ava found the newsletter folded neatly on her porch. She didn't rage. She didn't post online. She sat with it in silence, letting her pulse slow before folding the page in half and slipping it into a manila envelope already filled with receipts, permits, and screenshots. The folder was getting thicker by the week, and now she had just been handed one more page of evidence. She didn't need revenge. She needed exposure. By the following Monday, a new voice entered the story. A reporter from the Green Hollow Sentinel, a local newspaper with a modest but loyal readership, reached out via email. Her name was Maya Duran, and she didn't sound like she was chasing drama. She sounded like someone trying to document what the HOA hadn't expected anyone to question. Ava agreed to meet her. They sat on the porch, drinking tea and watching a few kids bike past the newly restored Larchwood sign. Maya asked thoughtful questions and listened closely. She didn't twist Ava's words or push for outrage. She simply asked for the facts. Ava gave her everything: dates, emails, documents. She laid it out plainly: what had been taken, what had been filed, and what the board was now doing to distort the truth. The article ran 3 days later under the headline, "Homeowner Reclaims History After HOA Rebrand. Legal Signs Spark Grassroots Movement." It was balanced, it was thorough, and it was devastating. Maya quoted from Whitney's newsletter and compared it line by line with Ava's permit filings. She included a photo of the original Larchwood street plaque, taken from Ava's personal collection, and a side-by-side image of the new Oak Harmony sign. She didn't tell people what to believe. She simply showed them the full picture, and that was enough. The fallout began that afternoon. The article spread beyond the neighborhood. It hit local Reddit threads, Facebook groups, and even a regional HOA watchdog blog. Messages started pouring into Ava's inbox, some from neighbors, others from total strangers who had been through similar fights. One message read, "You just gave every one of us permission to fight back the right way. Thank you." Another simply said, "Subscribe to Larchwood Collective. Keep going." The board called an emergency closed-door meeting 2 days later, but the damage had already been done. Someone from the inside, Ava never found out who, leaked the meeting minutes. They revealed a desperate and tone-deaf plan. The board had quietly contacted a signage contractor with the intent to remove Ava's historic markers and replace them with blank poles, citing temporary aesthetic disruption. The contractor declined the job. because they'd already seen the article. That same week, Ava received a letter from the city zoning commission. It wasn't a warning, it was an acknowledgement. Her documentation had been reviewed by the Public Records Committee. As a result, her decorative sign installation had been certified as a protected cultural display under the local Historic Streetscape Ordinance, a designation that hadn't been applied to a residential block in nearly 15 years. The letter included a seal and a sentence that made her blink twice. This designation prevents unauthorized removal, relocation, or obstruction of said signage by any private entity, including homeowners associations, without direct review and public hearing. In a single stroke, the city had taken the final word away from the board, and Ava hadn't even asked for it. The next HOA meeting was public and packed. Dozens of residents showed up, not in protest, but in quiet, resolute unity. The topic of signage was the first item on the agenda, and Whitney looked visibly strained when she read it aloud. Ava didn't speak. She didn't have to. 3 other neighbors stood up first, each one voicing their support for the historic signs, for the legal process Ava had followed, and for the memory that had been nearly erased by a rebranding no one had asked for. One man closed his remarks with a single sentence: "She didn't divide the community, she reminded it who it was." Whitney sat back down without a word. She didn't argue, because now, even she could feel it: the shift, the loss of narrative, the consequences of underestimating a quiet, strategic neighbor who refused to let her history be rewritten. The next HOA newsletter didn't arrive on glossy paper. It came stapled, black and white, no logo. The opening paragraph began with the word clarification, and by the third sentence, it was clear the board had dropped their fight. They didn't name Ava, they didn't address the legal defeat, but the tone had changed. Gone were the polished phrases like branding initiative and community cohesion. Instead, there was an awkward acknowledgement that signage decisions would now go through public hearing. It wasn't an apology, but it was surrender. And for Ava, that was louder than anything they could have said outright. Within a week, the neighborhood changed in subtle but permanent ways. People who had never spoken up before were suddenly showing up to meetings, not to complain, but to question. They asked for records. They asked for clarity. They asked why it had taken one resident with a folder and a filing fee to reveal how fragile the board's authority really was. Ava didn't attend the first meeting after the article went viral. She sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun stretch long across the sidewalk. Neighbors waved. A few stopped to talk. One woman, who had never said more than hello in the 10 years they'd lived down the street, came by with a printout of the newspaper article folded neatly in her purse. "I just wanted you to know, you reminded us we live here too." Ava smiled, nodded, and simply said, "That was the point." The board didn't dissolve, but it shrank. 2 longtime members resigned by the end of the month. One cited family obligations, the other claimed changing community priorities. Everyone knew they were exiting quietly, trying to avoid the shadow Ava's name had cast over the HOA's unchecked decisions. Whitney, somehow, remained, but she no longer led meetings from the front of the room. She sat among the other members now, quieter, less commanding, and far more careful with her words. Then came the vote. For the first time in Briar Glen's history, the neighborhood passed a motion requiring any change to public-facing features, signage, landscaping, even streetlight color, to undergo full community approval with at least 60% participation. It wasn't just policy, it was accountability. It was the neighborhood quietly writing into law what the board had once taken for granted, and Ava's quiet, steady presence had become the template for how to do it. The local news came back, this time with a camera crew. They didn't focus on drama, they focused on transformation. The segment was only 4 minutes long, but it captured what mattered: residents standing under the Larchwood sign, kids on bikes passing by, the original oak tree planted by Ava's father still standing tall at the edge of her yard. She didn't give an interview, she didn't want the spotlight, she just asked that they show the sign, and they did. In the closing shot, it stood directly beneath the HOA's Oak Harmony plaque, two names on one pole, side by side, and the contrast said everything. The fallout wasn't just political, it was personal. People began revisiting things they'd let go of, small pieces of their identity chipped away by years of polite compliance. A neighbor who had removed a pride flag after an anonymous complaint put it back up. A family that had painted their door beige to avoid fines now restored it to the deep red it had once been. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were reminders that no one should feel like a guest in their own home. Ava received letters from outside Briar Glen too, people from other states, other HOA-run neighborhoods. They told her how they'd been told to remove memorial benches, paint over murals, or rename gardens planted in memory of lost parents. They thanked her not for making noise, but for showing that you didn't need to be loud to be powerful. The Larchwood Collective, which Ava had originally created as a legal vehicle for filing signage rights, now became something more. Neighbors asked her to keep it active. She turned the website into a shared space for the neighborhood, photos, history, updates, and eventually a short blog that documented how the name had come back to life. The city even asked to archive her documentation as part of a local civic initiative about neighborhood identity and public memory. And for the first time in a long time, Ava felt like she had honored more than just a name. She had honored a story, one that could now be told in full. She still walked past the signs every morning, not out of pride, not to check on them, but as a quiet ritual, a way to stay grounded in the fact that something small, a name on a pole, could represent something so big, so intimate, so fiercely worth defending. And now it belonged to all of them again. The first time Ava walked past the Larchwood sign without flinching, it was raining. Not hard, just enough for the sidewalk to glisten and the wind to carry the smell of wet bark and memory. She had an umbrella tucked under one arm, but she didn't open it. Her hood was up, her hands were warm, and her sign stood steady in the mist, unaffected by the weather, like it had always belonged there. Because now it did, not because the city said so, not because the board allowed it, but because she had made sure of it. For weeks she had waited for the next conflict, for one more letter, one more smug visit, one more attempt to reclaim the narrative, but none came. The HOA had finally learned that pushing Ava only made her dig deeper. So instead of retaliation, they retreated. They focused on landscaping updates, community garden repairs, and a new welcome sign at the entrance. But they never touched the corner again. They didn't send workers, they didn't file complaints. They simply acted like the two signs had always coexisted, and for all practical purposes, they had. The Larchwood Collective continued quietly in the background. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't commercial, but Ava updated the site once a month. Photos of the trees in bloom, stories from longtime neighbors, archived scans of old neighborhood newsletters from the 90s. One day she posted a letter her father had written to the original developer, thanking them for naming the road after the trees he planted. The date on the letter was February 14, 1993, exactly 30 years to the day before the HOA tried to erase it. Now the letter was permanent, preserved in public record, and printed on a small plaque mounted at the base of the tree line. Someone else had added wildflowers around it. Ava didn't know who. She didn't ask. That was the whole point now. It didn't belong to her alone anymore. It belonged to the people who had cared enough to remember. One afternoon, she received a postcard, no return address, just a hand-drawn sketch of the Larchwood sign, and 5 words written in clean, even handwriting. You turned memory into law. Bravo. She placed it on her fridge beside a photo of her dad standing with a shovel, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Don't trim what's growing." She hadn't noticed the quote before. Now it felt like prophecy. The neighborhood moved forward, not under a new brand, but under a restored one. Residents began bringing back pieces of their past. A young couple repainted their porch in the same sky blue it had been when they moved in. An older man rebuilt the little free library his late wife once managed before the board had ordered it removed for clutter. These weren't rebellions, they were restorations, and Ava had lit the first match, not to burn anything down, but to illuminate what had always been worth protecting. She didn't run for the board, she didn't need to, but at the next election, 3 of the 5 open seats went to residents who had first met on her driveway, people who had shown up not to fight, but to listen, to witness, and to remember. They didn't promise big changes. They promised one simple thing: we'll never rename something that isn't ours to erase. That fall, the city published a digital gallery on community preservation. Larchwood Drive was the featured image. The caption beneath the photo read, "History isn't what gets written, it's what gets remembered." Ava clicked on the page, then closed the tab. She didn't need to read it twice. She already knew how the story ended, because Larchwood was more than a name, it was a promise, and now it will never be forgotten.